that I was is now lost. Hope, purpose, pleasure, all meaningless. I now walk in the shadows between worlds, and it is there I have finally glimpsed upon what lives in the dark corners of the earth.
Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is a first-person shooter horror game created by Headfirst Productions back in the year 2005. The game is set within the Cthulhu mythos created by the early 20th century American author H.P. Lovecraft. Although I'm not an expert of Lovecraft's work, my experience with the game was not hindered and actually made me interested into the source material. However, if you are familiar with H.P. Lovecraft's work, I found many references within the game that will make fans happy to see.
Rats, I hear them in the walls. Scratching, yes, scratching.
As a fan of survival horror games such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent and Outlast, I can say that Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is a decent horror game. While it does have some really irritating gameplay design choices, the story is still well written and keeps the player wanting to know more.
If you don't like it, just turn around and leave.
The game is set within the early 20th century. We play as private investigator Jack Walters, who has recently recovered from schizophrenia after being exposed to ancient horrors deep underground 6 years ago. Having no recollection of the past 6 years, Jack is attempting to piece his life together and find answers. It is during this that Jack receives a phone call requesting his assistance in finding a missing person in the secluded and gloomy town of Innsmouth. Jack reluctantly agrees and travels to Innsmouth to quickly discover there's more going on than just a missing person.
Holy shit!
Jack begins to investigate the secrets of Innsmouth, but quickly falls into the crosshairs of the town's elite called the Esoteric Order of Dagon, chasing him into a downward spiral of madness, death, and horrific truths. The exposition of Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is very well made, and is something I feel that the game doesn't receive too much credit on. The entire beginning sequence for Jack is one of the more interesting setups for protagonists that I've seen. However, most of the game pushes Jack's mystery aside for the main plot of finding the missing person and the rest of Jack's adventure. There are occasionally visions Jack will experience that keep us reminded of his mental state, but still feel disconnected to the overall main plot. Throughout the game's 10 levels will include several different environments along with many collectible documents scattered within them. These documents sometimes will be puzzle related, but more often than not will reveal lore and other information regarding the larger story. These documents are not too long though, and are not tedious to read. Most players won't understand some of these documents at first, but once reaching the end of the game, they will begin to make a lot more sense. Some of my favorite documents are the history of the antagonist of the game, the Esoteric Order of Dagon. The few documents about this order will reveal a more rational reason for the order's existence and its mission in the world. It's interesting stuff. It makes the world feel a lot more realistic rather than just good versus evil. The gameplay of Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth begins as a standard survival horror, giving no weapons or heads-up display to the player, but an inventory to store collected items and basic stealth mechanics to hide from enemies. In the first 4 levels is really where the game is at its best, allowing the player to explore the gloomy town of Innsmouth while getting a taste of the horror the game offers. During this, the player will be tasked to solve puzzles, collect items, interact with a small cast of characters, and use stealth to survive. The stealth mechanics are pretty straightforward and are not too difficult to get the hang of. As long as the player isn't too close to the enemy's sight, he won't be spotted. But uniquely, the player is given a sneak mode that makes the player move slower, quieter, and less noticeable to enemies. This mode helps in instances that would normally be risky. In addition to the stealth mechanics is Jack's sanity, which the player will have to maintain if exposed to horrific events or from tall heights. If Jack becomes too affected, the screen will become distorted and eventually lead to his death. In order to combat this, the player will have to look away from the horrors for a brief period of time in order to regain his sanity.
You alright there, sir? You're starting to look kind of funny there for a while.
There is also a neat healing system within the inventory that allows the player to heal individual injured parts of Jack using the split medical supplies from health packs. It's unique, but becomes underutilized due to the abundance of health packs scattered throughout the game. As mentioned earlier, the game starts off as a survival horror, but doesn't end as one. In the second half of the game changes to be a less refined first-person shooter, giving the player multiple weapons to use against the increasing number of threats. This doesn't mean stealth is entirely thrown out the window, as there are moments in the second half of the game that require it, but won't be the focal point of the gameplay. The weapons will feel a bit jarring to use at first, but only for maybe 10 minutes. Each weapon can be powerful in the correct situation, and ammo isn't too scarce to be a problem. At first, I thought the addition of the weapons was a huge mistake, but after playing through the game a second time, I can't say it's that terrible. The addition of the weapons don't destroy the horror element to the game, as the environments and enemies are not all that scary to begin with. The game is more about uncovering a mystery with added horror elements, but not enough to be immersive or scary. Sure, it technically has survival and horror elements, but nothing like the panic-inducing chases experienced in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Now, on the topic of survival is the game's difficulty. I would like to say that the game has only a few difficult moments, but on a first playthrough, this game is incredibly difficult and will cause some frustration. The three main culprits of this is the trial and error gameplay, save system, and puzzles. Throughout the experience are many difficult and timed interactions where trial and error becomes the epicenter of the gameplay. If the player does not do the correct thing or proceed at the correct time, then he or she will die. It can feel cheap and make the game a grueling test of patience rather than an enjoyable experience. This will become especially apparent in the notorious second chapter, Attack of the Fishmen, where the player is chased through a series of hotel rooms, having to lock doors, move furniture, and do some basic platforming. However, this chapter doesn't stop there, as it continues into a stealth section that can be very difficult and require a few attempts to succeed.
Christ, they're everywhere. I need to keep my head down.
This section, along with many other difficult sections in the game, can be somewhat alleviated if the player were able to save at any time. But unfortunately, the player cannot manually save using the pause menu, and this leads to the second point of contention. The player must instead find these Cthulhu star or eye symbols placed within the level in order to save the game. Due to this, dying then becomes more cumbersome, as there are instances where these symbols are placed inconveniently, creating large gaps of gameplay to be erased upon death. Another pain the placement of these symbols inflict are the positioning of them, sometimes behind unskippable cutscenes, forcing the player to rewatch the scene. The last source of frustration provided is the game's many puzzles. While some of these puzzles are pretty clever, most of the time are incredibly difficult and confusing. The main problem has to do with almost the complete lack of direction the game gives, causing the player to wander around and again resort to trial and error to solve puzzles. Of course, most of these problems are remedied on second playthrough or by having a guide, but also could have been fixed if the developers gave some sort of objective list written in the player's diary, like how Frictional Games did with the Journal in Penumbra and the Amnesia games. But to summarize the gameplay experience of Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth, it's not fantastic, It can be extremely infuriating at times, but it's not unplayable by any means. Do yourself a favor and keep a guide close by. The graphics quality of Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is, of course, by 2020 standards, not very good, but even as a 2005 title, it wasn't that impressive. It's not ugly by any means, it's just not as good as what was out at the time. However, we must keep in mind it was developed by an indie developer studio using its own engine for the original Xbox, so I can't rag on the graphics too much. Unfortunately, the game is locked at 60 FPS, meaning anyone with a higher refresh rate monitor won't be able to play the game in a smoother experience, and has no controller support despite this being an original Xbox title. If you're attempting to play this game on the PC, then you are probably more than familiar with the crashing issues plaguing the PC releases. Save your sanity and play the good old games version with the fan-made patch installed. In order to complete the game, you may also have to use the patch to raise your character's speed or to turn on God mode. The last escape sequence in the game has a section that will kill you 100% of the time due to the player's speed not being fast enough to dodge falling rocks. I didn't have this issue on my second playthrough though, so it might be just the game deciding it wants to be merciful or not. As for the sound, I can happily say that the game is excellent in most regards. In particular, the ambient sounds and soundtrack are perfectly chosen for the type of game the developers were going for. As for the voices, I really enjoyed the broken talk of the Innsmouth townsfolk and other various enemies in the game.
If I see you without fire, I'll report your order.
Oh, don't say nothing!
Although Jack does have a few lines that are a little bit cringeworthy,
I let it loose. It's all my fault.
all in all, most voice acting in the game is not bad and can crack some smiles along the way.
I don't believe you have an invitation to our little party.
Just check the guest list. I'm under the section for fellas that ain't ugly freaks.
Despite the few poorly designed gameplay choices, Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is still a horror game worth playing for its compelling story. The game will take around 8 to 10 hours of playtime for a first playthrough, but may take longer due to some of the harder puzzles in the game. There is a scoring system at the end of each playthrough that adds some replayability, along with extra difficulties unlocked and a hidden cutscene. But honestly, I'd give the game a couple playthroughs to fully understand and uncover what hides in the dark corners of the earth.
I like the way you smile at me, baby. I like the view from here, and when you call me dear, I like the way you smile at me, baby.